Timothy Shannon is a professor of history at Gettysburg College and the author of Iroquois Diplomacy on the Early American Frontier. Tim, who were the Iroquois?
So, Phil, the Iroquois were a group, I should say are a group of Native American nations or tribes who had their historical homelands in upstate New York, and those extended southward into the Susquehanna Valley. We described them as a Native American confederacy because it wasn't a single nation, it was a group of nations. When the Dutch and then the English first encountered them, they called them the Five Nations, moving from east to west: the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. By the time we get into the early 18th century, another nation, the Tuscaroras, have migrated northward from North Carolina into the region of the upper Susquehanna Valley, and they have become the sixth nation of the Confederacy. Today, you'll often hear them referred to as the Haudenosaunee, which is translates to the people of the Longhouse, which is the term they used to describe their confederacy. But the term Iroquois comes to us from the French in the colonial period, who encountered them through the fur trade.
Now, this confederacy was a very powerful political entity in the 1600s and 1700s in Northeast North America. Why were they so powerful?
That's a very good question, and it has a lot to do with both the political nature of their confederacy and with their geographic location. That spot south of Lake Ontario was very strategic ground between the French in Canada, initially the Dutch in New Netherland, and then the English in New York, and Indian nations further west. So when we talk about the development of the fur trade during the colonial era, you had to go through, if you were a Dutch or an English fur trader, you had to go through the Iroquois homelands to get to animal pelts in the Great Lakes watershed, right? And certainly if you were the French in Canada, the Iroquois were a potential source for furs, but they were also potential interlopers in the French fur trade with Indian nations further west in the Great Lakes. So geographically, they occupied very strategic territory that the imperial powers of Europe were going to compete for. And then the other element here is their confederacy. They were not a single Indian nation. They were a group of Indian nations who worked cooperatively to defend their common territory, their borders, from interlopers, be they Native Americans or Europeans. And they also worked cooperatively in their diplomacy with outsiders. And so that cooperation did give them a strategic advantage when they were dealing with the forces unleashed by the European colonization of North America.
How are these nations organized politically? How do they make decisions about things like diplomacy?
Like other Indian nations in the Northeast, their politics were kinship-based. And so there was a great deal of autonomy in individual communities. The best way to think of the Confederacy is as a mutual non-aggression pact. At its very core, it was an agreement among the five and then ultimately the six nations that they would not make war on each other. All right, and so that was the element of cooperation that was at the center of the Confederacy. Otherwise, each nation was made up of individual communities, towns, villages in their territory, and those communities tended to act with a great deal of autonomy when it came to decisions about who they were going to trade with, who were they going to make war against, who they might ally with, and so forth. Within those communities, it's kind of a misnomer to describe them as being democratic. They were not democratic in our modern sense of one vote, one person, representative assemblies, and that sort of thing. Rather, it was kinship-based. Within each community, there were clans, and clans had lineages that gave people their sense of belonging. And so within each community, there was a council that would be made up of representatives from those lineages. Those representatives were males, but they were appointed by the elder females of those lineages. So there was a great deal of kind of shared power between both genders, between male and female within these communities. And then the Confederacy itself had a Grand Council that would meet in Onondaga, the central nation of the Confederacy. And that Grand Council would both act in a ritual manner to renew the alliance each year by going through certain shared rituals, but also to deal with kind of common interests and concerns. And so the Grand Council might convene periodically to discuss matters of war and peace and so forth.
How did they wage war? You talk about mourning war. What does that mean?
So a lot of the Confederacy was built around rituals that were related to what was called the condolence ceremony, a way in which people would gather and exchange gifts and ritualistic expressions of condolence when someone died. And warfare was directly related to this. Like other Indian nations in the Northeast, the Iroquois did not go to war for the purpose of conquering foreign territory, subjecting people who were not like them to their rule. Warfare tended to be a matter of the expression of condolence, mourning for losses that people had suffered. So there was no conscription, there was no draft, there was no single powerful ruler, dictating when to go to war. Rather, at a community level, when the community had suffered some kind of loss, war parties would come together with the blessings of the clan matrons, the clan mothers, to go out and make war against an enemy so that prisoners might be brought back. And those prisoners might be adopted into the community to be raised up in place of somebody who they had lost, or those prisoners might be ritualistically tortured and executed as a way of expressing the grief, venting the grief of the community. Those captives could also be sold or traded to other nations as a way of entering into alliance with them. When colonial peoples show up, colonial captives might also be ransomed back to their families or to the colonial governments in exchange for trade goods.
How did the Iroquois see the relationship between war and diplomacy?
So the Iroquois described diplomacy as the means by which they conducted their relations with outsiders, and they described trade and diplomacy as going hand in hand. People that you had diplomatic relations with, you traded with. This was certainly true when European power showed up. Any European power that wanted to engage in the fur trade with the Iroquois had to learn their art, their practice of diplomacy in order to open and maintain that relationship. And the metaphor that was often used to describe this relationship was that of the path. A path that would run between the land of the Iroquois and the territory of the French or the Dutch or the British. And so an open path meant free communication, free trade between those different communities. And an open path would be maintained by regular diplomatic exchange, oftentimes involving diplomatic gifts that were given back and forth as evidence of the regard that each side had for the other. The enactment of these condolence rituals and similar types of rituals that were meant to ensure continued good relations. When the path was blocked, it meant that a state of war existed. And so that might be because of some act of violence that had occurred. It might be because of some external circumstances of warfare between different colonial powers that the Iroquois were taking a side in. Right? But a blocked path meant that there was the potential for war parties to be going out and attacking each other. As the Iroquois made peace, opened paths with more native and colonial peoples outside of their home territory, they had to travel farther and farther to find enemies to make war with. And so, by the early 1700s, in the colonial records, we see evidence of Iroquois war parties traveling really quite remarkable distances, such as into, say, the backcountry of Virginia or North Carolina to make war against Indian nations like the Cherokees and the Catawbas, who were hundreds of miles away because the Iroquois were at peace, engaged in diplomacy with native peoples in, say, the Susquehanna Valley and what's today the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Maryland.
Well, let's talk about just generically some of the different elements of Iroquois diplomacy. There are everything from wampum belts to, you mentioned gifts earlier. Let's talk about some of those different elements.
Yeah, there's a very interesting material culture around Iroquois diplomacy, and Europeans had to learn very quickly how to manipulate this material culture. It's a testimony to the strength and influence of the Iroquois that when European colonists show up, they have to learn how to conduct this business on Iroquois terms rather than forcing the Iroquois to adopt their terms. And so some of the material artifacts that are involved here include wampum belts. Wampum is manufactured out of marine shell, and wampum strings would be marine shell beads strung on leather strings, and then those could be woven together to make belts. And those belts were kind of the, today we might say the credentials, the certificates that a diplomat would use to show, I've been sent with a legitimate message by legitimate authority to conduct this business with you. The Iroquois were pre-literate at the time Europeans showed up. And so these wampum belts had kind of ritualistic significance as a way of presenting your credentials as an outsider, that you're here for a peaceful purpose, to open up a path, to maintain a path for trade and diplomacy. But those belts were also exchanged during speech making at the council fire as a way of serving as a kind of a mnemonic device that this belt represents this point I'm making to you. And if that belt is accepted by the other side, that the other side understands the point that's being made and is agreeing to this point. If it's rejected, the other side clearly has some issue with the point or issue that's being presented. There are other elements here, gift giving. Typically, Native Americans would give European diplomats who were showing up bundles of furs, beaver pelts being the most valuable, but also other animal pelts that were part of the fur trade. Europeans would give donations of trade goods that the Indians valued. So that might include things like, the most common was any kind of woven cloth, woolens that were used by natives and that were also purchased in the fur trade. But also things like metal wares, knives, hatchets, any kind of edged tool that the Indians valued very much. But also a wide variety of other things, some novelty items like mouth harps, combs, mirrors, that sort of thing. Other things including alcohol, including firearms, gunpowder, so forth. So it was very important that you show up with the appropriate diplomatic gifts. As time goes on and the value of the Iroquois alliance becomes more and more important to these colonial powers, these gifts tend to become very valuable just in terms of the amount of goods that are being used to ensure that these diplomatic relations continue.
What was the covenant chain?
The covenant chain is the alliance that the Iroquois had with the British colonies in North America. We can think of this as kind of a multilateral alliance. It was based in the colony of New York. It was primarily Dutch merchants and magistrates in what became the British city of Albany that was kind of the focal point of the covenant chain. And during the Dutch colonial period of New Netherland, that's where this alliance begins between the Dutch and the Iroquois. And then when the English take over in the late 17th century, other English colonies enter into this alliance. So at its height, the covenant chain includes not just New York, but Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. All these colonies have hold of the covenant chain. A metaphor that was used to describe it was linking arms together. And so, think of kind of paper cutout dolls of everyone grasping each other's hands. And the designs that were woven into wampum belts were meant to represent, these would be geometric designs, sometimes human figures that were linked at the hands to show that they were all party to this common alliance.
What was the Iroquois relationship with the Pennsylvania colonial government?
So Pennsylvania, of course, is established in the 1680s by William Penn, and the Iroquois connection to Pennsylvania is primarily through the Susquehanna Valley. And the Iroquois have been participating in the fur trade that's associated with the Susquehanna Valley. And in the late 17th century, the Iroquois had also been warring with the Susquehannock Indians. The Susquehannock Indians were a tribe based in the lower Susquehanna Valley. They were Iroquoian speaking, meaning they had a language that had the same root as the other Iroquoian languages, but they were not part of the Confederacy. And so the Iroquois made war against the Susquehannocks in the 1670s for access to the fur trade in the lower Susquehanna Valley. By the time William Penn and his heirs are establishing the colony of Pennsylvania in the late 17th and early 18th century, the Iroquois have emerged as kind of the most powerful native power in the Susquehanna Valley. And there are other Indian nations that have migrated into the Susquehanna Valley, primarily nations that have been displaced by the colonization of the Chesapeake Bay region, Maryland and Virginia and so forth. And those nations are part of the Iroquois Confederacy. They do not belong to the League of the 5 or 6 nations, but they have diplomatic relations with the Iroquois. Again, there's a lot of metaphoric language used here, and so sometimes they're referred to as props to the longhouse, or that the longhouse has extended its rafters to include these people within peaceful diplomatic relations with the Iroquois. The other nation that is very powerful and important here are the Delaware Indians, or the Lenni Lenape, whose homelands were initially in the Delaware River Valley, but by the early 18th century, the colonization of New Jersey and Pennsylvania has also displaced some of these people into the Susquehanna Valley and even further west into the Ohio Valley. And in the 1730s and 1740s, the Iroquois begin asserting their power over the Delaware Indians. And the Delaware kind of chafe a little bit about that. And so a sort of competition develops between the Delaware and the Iroquois for authority, and especially the Susquehanna Valley and eastern Pennsylvania. And the Pennsylvania government gets involved with that. By this time, William Penn is long gone. He died in the 17 teens. His sons have inherited the colony. They don't share his Quaker principles when it comes to dealing with Native Americans. They are not as committed to peaceful relations, the image of a peaceable kingdom that William Penn had promoted. What they're interested in is land. And what they find in the 1740s is that if they deal with the Iroquois are much more willing to sell land in the colony of Pennsylvania to the Penn family than the Delaware Indians are. And so the Iroquois and the Penn family develop what they call a chain of friendship that leads to several treaties in the 1740s and 1750s in which Iroquois representatives agree to sell land to the Penn family at the expense of Delaware Indians and some other native peoples living in what is the modern state of Pennsylvania today.
And one of the most significant of those treaties was the Treaty of Lancaster in 1744.
Yes.
What was significant about it?
So the Treaty of Lancaster occurs in 1744 in what at that time is the frontier community of Lancaster, and it is really an excellent example of how Iroquois diplomacy worked at kind of the peak of the power of the Iroquois Confederacy in the 18th century. And so if we can kind of set the stage, we're talking about a frontier community of, maybe several hundred people. And the governor of Pennsylvania calls for a meeting of the Iroquois with several other colonies, including Maryland and Virginia. Both send delegations to the Treaty of Lancaster. And about 250 Iroquois Indians show up, men, women, and children. If you can kind of visually picture this, right? We have 250 native people walking into a town that probably doesn't have a population much larger than that. The men all armed, all right? So, in any other scene, you'd think, this small frontier community is surrounded, it's under attack. But no, it's a treaty. Everybody knows what's going on. The Indians enter singing songs of greetings and peace. The governor greets them at the courthouse. He toasts them. Again, ritual exchange of wampum and greetings of condolence. And then the Iroquois set up camp outside of town. And over the next several weeks, this treaty goes on. And it involves a very ritualized presentation of speeches. Each side gives a speech, and then they retire for a day or two while the other side composes its speech, which will occur in response. So the idea is to maintain an air of amity, of thoughtfulness. This is not, getting together and breaking out into shouting matches or fisticuffs or anything like that. They are very, very well behaved. The Iroquois in particular put a very heavy emphasis on saying what you mean. And so when you say what you mean, you better reflect on it and think about it before you utter those words. And so it's a sign of the gravity of the situation. It's the sign of the thoughtfulness that's going into it, that you wait and you really reflect and you gather and you develop a consensus about what you're going to say before you present it to the other side. This, of course, drives the governor crazy because it means this treaty is going to take several weeks. He has to play host. He has to provide food. There are feasts and so forth that go on. You have to treat your guests properly, hospitality, and so forth. So these treaties can be very expensive for the governing officer who's presiding over them. And the Iroquois know that. And so they kind of play a game of the longer this takes, probably the more pliable the governor will be to ultimately seeing things our way. But what also happens at the Treaty of Lancaster is the governments of Maryland and Virginia are there because they do want to buy land. And they want to buy land from the Iroquois. And remember, this is not territory that's in Iroquois, modern upstate New York. The Virginians are interested in laying claim to the territory around the forks of the Ohio, modern-day Pittsburgh. The Marylanders are laying claim to territory in what today is the panhandle of Maryland, the western part of Maryland. And so some very interesting speeches occur in which, in both cases, the representatives from Virginia and Maryland are saying to the Iroquois, we already bought this land, and the Iroquois are saying, well, we don't care what the king told you. This is our territory, and are asserting possession of it, again, in a very kind of forceful way over any other native peoples that might actually live closer to that territory, like the Delaware and the Shawnees and some other groups, and are basically saying, we have the right to sell you this land because we say so. And if you want to do business with us, this is how you're going to do it. So in both cases, the Virginians and the Marylanders agree and give, in some cases, cash, in other cases, considerable donations of material goods to make these purchases. But there are going to be ramifications for this, of course, when in the 1750s, when the 7 Years' War, as we call it in America, the French and Indian War, breaks out, and in exactly that territory, the forks of the Ohio that had been, sold away by the Iroquois to the Virginians at this particular meeting.
So as these negotiations take place, what are some of the long-term consequences? You mentioned the 7 Years' War.
Yeah. So I think certainly the long-term consequences have to do with the dispossession of Native peoples. And, when we think about Native peoples today east of the Mississippi River, right, we typically think about the Jacksonian era and Indian removal, in the 1830s, and the federal government and state governments working together to forcibly eject Native peoples from land that was their ancestral homes, push them west of the Mississippi River. And what I would emphasize, as somebody who studies the 1600s, the 1700s, is, long before Andrew Jackson and the federal government and the era of removal, these sorts of land deals, real estate deals, are being negotiated by colonial governments in many respects with the same purpose, to lay claim to Indian territory and to force Indians off of it so that it can be claimed, redistributed among people of European descent. And the Iroquois, to a certain degree, are complicit in this in the 18th century when they sell land to the colonial government of Pennsylvania or to the colonial government of New York that they don't actually occupy. That's land occupied by other Indian nations that have become subordinate to the Iroquois because of the strength of their confederacy. And it's a process that begins, in negotiation over all sorts of things: war, peace, alliance, fur trade, land cessions, land sales. But by the time we get into the mid-18th century, about the time of the Treaty of Lancaster, we see that this type of diplomacy is being used increasingly to dispossess Indians, to conduct real estate deals.
We've been speaking with Timothy Shannon. He's a professor of history at Gettysburg College and the author of Iroquois Diplomacy on the Early American Frontier. Tim, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's been a pleasure.